Good morning. Welcome to the fourth meeting of the committee in 2014. Can I ask everyone to ensure they've switched off all mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please? Agenda item 1 today is an oral evidence session on the draft third National Planning Framework in review of the Scottish planning policy. Can I welcome our panel this morning? Malcolm MacLeod, Chair of the Heads of Planning Scotland, Stephen Tucker, the convener of the Royal Town and Planning Institute Scotland, Hugh Crawford, the President, Official Representative for the Royal Incorporation of Architects Scotland, and Suzanne McIntosh, a committee member for the Royal Incorporation of Architects Scotland. Welcome and good morning. Do you have any opening statements that you'd like to make at all?
I was just going to say on behalf of the RTPI, thanks very much for the opportunity to come along and give evidence today. Much appreciated.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you, first of all, to what extent the success of MPF 1 and MPF 2 in achieving their aims has been assessed, and the adequacy of monitoring arrangements for MPF 3? Mr MacLeod, do you want to go first, please?
Well, thank you also for the opportunity to give evidence this morning. We very much welcome this redraft of NPF 3, and I think it probably has taken on board the lessons or the outcomes from MPF 1 and 2, and indeed from the main issues report that was published previously. We think the approach that has been adopted in terms of a more punchy document, one that is more spatially based, is a step forward. It's much clearer as to what the outcomes are in terms of development, in terms of what planning can deliver, the where element, and which leaves the how, obviously, to the SPP. So we're overall pleased. I think there are a few issues that we feel perhaps haven't been brought forward as well as they could have been, particularly in relation to some of the major developments that have been put forward by our members, our national developments rather, haven't been taken forward. Perhaps there is still areas of Scotland which are perhaps not as clearly represented as to their role in national development, particularly rural parts of Scotland. That's one area that we feel could have been improved. But generally speaking, we think building on NPF 1 and MPF 2 that we're definitely going in the right direction, and it's setting out a very strong framework for us taking forward our local development plans.
In evidence last week, the Minister talked about the original amount of plans that were submitted to go forward, and talked about how that was dealt with and how it was whittled down. Do you think the process of dealing with that is right? Obviously, you say that you're concerned about certain things that didn't go through. Do you think the process that's being used at this moment is the right one?
I think that the consultation that's been carried out on the preparation of the plan has been proportionate, it's been reasonable. There was a good opportunity for everybody to contribute to it. And I think the emphasis that has been on a much more place-based approach, something that's it's not just about volumes and volumes of text. It's something that's much more easy to understand and clear. I'm welcoming that. I'm not criticising it. I think, like any consultation, there will always be those who perhaps feel that their views aren't represented as best they could be. One of the issues with NPF as it currently stands, some of our members feel that perhaps it's not been ambitious enough, that the national developments contained within it are particularly around Dundee and Ravenscraig. It's fantastic to see these, and it really sets out the way forward. But where are the next Ravenscraig? Where are the next Dundee waterfront? Some views are that perhaps is it just a statement of current projects that are identified? Are we being visionary enough? Are we being ambitious enough? But as with all these things, in every consultation, it doesn't matter what kind of plan it is, whether it's a strategic development plan or a local development plan. Quite simply, you probably couldn't fit everyone's expectations within it. And just finally, I think one of the issues raised at the time of the main issues report was particularly the relationship to the cities and the role of the cities. And I think that has been brought forward to the final version of the draft that we've got before us just now. There is more evidence of the link towards the city's work that's underway. Whether that could be strengthened, I think it probably could be. There could be much more of a link towards the action programme that is being brought separately through that stream of work. And whilst we, as a group, feel that the areas of coordinated action that were within the previous draft, they've been amended and changed to perhaps reflect other priorities, such as the low-carbon priority and the cities. Whilst there is some disappointment that perhaps, for example, one on the West Coast that was promoted by Argyll and Bute and Western Isles and Highland, for example, isn't taken forward, I think the key elements of it have been reflected, albeit in a slightly different form.
Okay, Mr. Tucker, please.
Excuse me. RTPI submitted evidence pointing to the need for MPF and SPP to be ambitious, influential, focused on delivery based around outcomes, and to provide clarity on how it sits with SDP and LDPs particularly. I think from our point of view, we're generally very supportive of the MPF and SPP documents. Possibly most importantly, we're supportive of the planning hierarchy. I think now we're in a situation where the planning hierarchy in Scotland is genuinely regarded as a good model. It will take time for that model to be got right. It will take time for that model to work on the ground. And crucially, it will take time for the vision and ambition in documents at the higher level to be passed down through strategic development plans and local development plans. The machinery is right. The key now is delivering it on the ground. And with that, in that regard, I think we're very supportive of MPF in the process thus far.
Is there a failure in the hierarchy when local authorities and regional areas fail to come up with new LDPs and strategic plans?
I don't think there's a failure as such. I mean, there is a reality, which is that planning is a democratic process. Planning has forces upon it, for example, over the last 5 years, the market, which impacts on delivery timescales and how things are achieved on the ground. You can set all the objectives we like at a higher national level, but they need to work on the ground. They need to be open to a democratic process. Sometimes communities, for example, don't want to see certain developments happen, and that is part of the planning process. So things are tested as they pass down through that hierarchy, through the strategic and the local level, and that's right. I think the key that accompanies the reform of planning that was identified many years ago is culture change, becoming a more ambitious, more proactive, more development and delivery-focused planning system. And I think we're getting there. It doesn't always get there in the way perhaps it starts off or it's expected to. But that's planning, and that's the process. And I think the key things for us is, if we're visionary about what we're trying to achieve, if we're focused on doing things that are for the national and for the local good, for the country's good, if we take into account the environment, and if we, crucially, are willing to work together, public and private sector, to make sure the best developments happen in the best places, in the most sustainable places, then I think in time that framework will deliver the excellent results on the ground that it expects to or sets out to.
Well, playing devil's advocate a little bit, we hear from developers that things often take too long. Mm-hmm. We often hear from our constituents that things are done too fast, and often that don't follow the plans that are there in place. Do you think that the national planning framework, the planning policies, the strategic plans and the local development plan, if they're done right, can stop these kind of conflicts? I think or at least soften the conflict a little bit.
Planning is not an easy subject. Development has impacts. Development impacts upon communities and it impacts upon the environment. And the balance is always whether that development is sustainable and is for the common good. I remember being over in Germany a few years ago, and I was asking the mayor of a particular, somewhere in Bavaria, asking what happens if somebody challenges your development plan, and they looked at me quizzically and said, well, why would they? Because the culture there is very plan-led. The culture in this country is quite different. We're quite independent. We challenge things. We test things. And I think the planning process is part of that culture. It's reflective of that culture. Key to it is communication. In the move to a plan-led system, we've got to keep debating things. We've got to keep communicating things. And we've got to be honest between the public and private sector and be honest with communities about what we're trying to achieve. Malcolm and I were speaking earlier about the fact that I think over the last 5-10 years, you've seen a planning system which is much more about communication between the public and private sector about getting things. Frustrations are there on all sides, but that's planning, that's development, and that's why it's a democratic process.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you very much, Convener. My colleague and I both are both planners, but we come from a design background and representing the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland, and welcome the opportunity to appear before you. From that background, represent the interests of many practitioners, those who are dealing with the planning system, those who are looking to the machinery that's there, looking to find the things that are necessary for them to make the decisions. And I think that in looking at the two background documents that we're discussing today, I think they go a long way to helping in that process. It's important in dealing with those who are going to put their time, energy and resources behind something that they know where they're actually going with it. And if there are moves can be made to take out uncertainty, or at least reduce uncertainty to a level where people are prepared to make investments, I think that is a good thing. So to a great extent, in looking at the documents, we're concerned with the process which people would follow in using these documents, and are the documents up to helping them make the decisions to look to investment. I think these documents do that. I think it's helpful to have them very place-specific, and to know that within the particular areas, within particular cities, within particular coastlines, this is what we can expect. I think that also that there's a fine line to be drawn between planning too far. That many things can arise, as we've seen over the past 4 years, which are perhaps predictable, but nevertheless have a severe effect on where we're going, and suddenly the planning machinery has to change and do an about turn and cope with all sorts of things. So I think that in looking to a 5-year plan such as we have, building on what has been there before, I think it's a good balance of things. We're going far enough, but not too far, to try and predict the unpredictable. So that I think to that extent that's helpful. In looking to the suite of documents, I think it would be difficult to talk about both these policy documents without looking to the sort of lead up and the background, the whole sort of matter of placemaking, and all the special interests, and looking particularly at an environment that people can enjoy, and reach this position of what we call well-being. So I think that has been a good background leading into what we're considering today. Looking to the machinery that's set out, I think that could almost have a debate in itself. And we have touched in the paper we set out how this affects practitioners who are using the system, and even goes as far as looking to the appeal system and what we might expect from that. And once again, people will go to where the expectations can be more clearly defined.
Thank you. Ms McIntosh, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I have a few points I'd like to add. I won't repeat what the previous speakers have said, but I'm very much in agreement with the things that are being said. I would have liked to have seen more emphasis on a European context, especially in the national planning framework. I felt that was a real positive in one of the first can't remember if it was National MPF 1 or 2, but certainly there was a clear definition of Scotland's role in Europe, specifically in Northern Europe. And I would like to see that fed through into the new document. Another issue that certainly a lot of my work's involved in, and the practitioners in the RIS, is rural development and acting for people in some of our remote locations where it can often be particularly tricky to gain planning permission for an existing business or operation to grow. And given the emphasis on sustainable economic growth and the need to resist depopulation of rural areas, it's something I feel very strongly about. And I was disappointed to note the decline in, or the dissemination of rural homes for rents grants to developers. Certainly 2-3 years ago that happened and hasn't been replaced with anything else. And I think that's an important opportunity through the national developments and the strategic layer of planning to think also about how we're assisting that to happen and how the implementation on the ground is actually happening for those out there who are attempting to desist the rural depopulation through small-scale developments that come forward, perhaps not as a part of the local plan. So we have to have one eye on that it's not always everything that's in the plan that tends to happen on the ground, and the other way around. Now, the other thing that we've heard a lot about is people mention a completely different topic, but conflict resolution. And I've heard it mentioned possibly 3 times around the table at the moment. And as a planning mediator, mediation and planning is something that, again, I feel very strongly about, and my colleague's also a mediator. We've attempted to bring mediation into the mainstream planning system. It's very difficult to get it embedded in the system. You have to rely on willing parties coming to the table to take part in it. And it's not something that has really taken off in a serious way at the moment. So there's an opportunity again at this strategic level of thinking to embed serious attempts at conflict resolution in order to get a smoother planning system.
Okay, I think we'll probably come back to conflict resolution and mediation from some of the other questioners here today. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd start off, Convener, question direct to Mr MacLeod in relation to the submission that you made to the committee for today's discussion. In question 1, you were asked about the key principles underpinning it. Then go on in your answer, or in the answer of the Heads of Planning Scotland, to issue a challenge to the government about how we reconcile the legal duties on local planning authorities to comply with sustainable development as opposed to economic development. And then you go on to talk about environmental issues that should be considered. Do you think there has been enough recognition taken in terms of MPF 3 and SPP to the issues raised? Because for many communities throughout Scotland, in terms of the economic development and basically the challenges there about healthy environments, creating healthy environments, could be seen as a major challenge, particularly when communities see the eradication of the green belt and other environmental factors that basically are pushed aside for what could be seen as, or argued as, economic development progress in certain areas.
Mr MacLeod.
Okay. Well, we certainly welcome the additional consultation that was undertaken on this matter in terms of looking at the sustainable development element to it. So we welcomed that consultation and we made a contribution to that. It is always going to be a challenge to balance up social, economic and environmental factors, and indeed I think it's come out of the first round of questions that is at the heart of planning. So I think it's always going to be a challenge to do that, but I think we're certainly going in the right direction in what's been produced so far and what has been consulted on, and obviously we await the final version. What we want to make sure is that there is not it doesn't become an industry in itself with the various assessments that are required in order to to demonstrate economic viability, etc., that there is a proportionate approach to it. But I think the overall view is that our job is all about balancing these three elements up. And my view is that we already do that on a day-to-day basis, dealing with every single application that is dealt with, and indeed when we're determining allocations within plans. So I think it's going in the right direction, but it's right at the heart of planning, and I think we're already good at making that judgment as to sustainable developments in the right place.
Convener, just there's a number of issues that I would like to follow up, but given the time we've got today, Convener, I think I can deal with that. It's just I want to focus on the comments Mr Tucker made when he referred to the balance and the need for culture change, and he referred to between the private and public sector, and used the example of Bavaria when you were in Bavaria, speaking to the mayor there about, is there a different culture on the continent, particularly Germany and others, where the communities, and you talked about public-private sector, I'm talking about communities, because one of the big issues that we face as elected members when we're dealing with planning issues, and the convener alluded to it, is that we often get drawn into discussions and debates about when communities have engaged fully in the process of, say, developing a local plan, and all of a sudden a developer comes along completely out of the blue and slaps another development down in front of planners, and planners are then asked to take on board that development, despite the fact the communities have been engaged for some time. And as I raised it last week about the confidence that communities have in the planning process, and what is the difference in, say, Bavaria compared to what happens in Scotland at the present moment. There seems to be a lack of confidence and participation by the general public in planning decisions.
Mr Tucker.
I'll try my best to answer that one. I'm not an expert on Bavarian planning or European planning, but I'll give you my experiences and my knowledge. I think culture is clearly different, without going into all the details of that. Culture is different in different parts of our country. I think for me, what I would reflect upon is the fact that communities exist at many different levels. We have the local community, the street where you live, the neighbourhood where you live. We have then maybe the town where you live, and maybe then sometimes the city or the city region. And you find that those different communities feel differently about different proposals. So, for example, at a city level, sometimes the community feels really positive about that new factory and 2,000 jobs and all that investment coming into the local community. But the street next to where that factory goes, that's a real challenge. So I think and it's something you obviously do regularly, we have to, as planners, balance those different views and the impacts of development at those different levels. I think that what we're getting toward with the plan-led system, and I think something that's quite common on the continent, is an openness and transparency about planning. I think planning is much longer term, so they will do plans for 30 or 40 years. It's a real vision of how a city or a city region develops, and it's a very physical vision. This is how this is going to develop over time. This is where the tram lines are going to run, the railways are going to run. This is how our city is going to grow. And I think that's something that our planning system is moving toward. I think I think the planning hierarchy helps that. And I think that's a very healthy direction that we're travelling in. But it means that we need to be much more honest and upfront with communities about how places might develop over those 30, 40 years. And we need to be saying that in the plan, as opposed to developers, who I represent very often, coming along with individual ideas for this site and that site. Part of the reason that developers come along with those projects or ideas is that they feel that the plan does not take into account fully the opportunities that exist around a city or town. So there needs to be in the process of moving towards a plan-led system, there needs to be perhaps a greater awareness of market forces, where developers want to build, where opportunities exist. I think we're actually at a really exciting point in planning, where in the move to being plan-led, we're going to get to a much more physical, ambitious and visionary planning system over the next few years. We just need to make sure, collectively, that we're taking communities at all those different levels with us.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Convener. It's just it's that balance between the 30, 40-year vision plan and what we have in terms of MPF, the SPP and the local development plans, and how do we get that message over. And that might be a question for Ms McIntosh in relation to the arbitration and mediation that has to take place between communities, because once somebody moves into an area, a new housing development, they expect the nice wooded area and the nice fields that surround the development look good when they move in there, but only to find out maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road, there's going to be, for instance, Mr Tucker's example, potentially a factory planted next door to them. How do we deal with those type of long-term issues, and how do we engage with communities to ensure that they are fully aware of these future developments and future proposals?
Ms McIntosh.
Yeah, certainly. As I personally have acted for communities in high conflict situations through public inquiries and helping them engage in the process at that level, if you like. So I come to this with that sort of experience as well as the sort of smaller level mediation experience. Something I've noticed over the years is that communities are reluctant, or have been reluctant, to get involved at the strategic level of thinking. It's easier when you get the neighbour notification through your door to actually think, that's going to happen behind my house, the factory behind my house. So at that point, they engage in the process. They're not actually physically engaging in the process at the point where they should be. They should be involved in the plan-making stage, which we've gone a long way to try and get people to engage in. You'll find that local authorities have moved from their original position of an exhibition in the library type of thing to using social media, to trying to engage with schools and young people, and to let them get involved in the plan-making process. That, for me, is the starting point that we need to move to, communicating and getting people involved at that stage. But we still have to deal with the issue of people being disgruntled and coming to your doors when the planning application appears on the council's portal. Now, at that stage, there's often an opportunity for a more effective level of communication between developers, local authority planners and communities. We have a situation at the moment where we have community councils as statutory consultees. Some local authorities don't have community councils. They have non-existent members. They don't meet. So we have a failure there in getting people to address their roles and responsibilities as active citizens. You know, how do we look at that and get people participating not just in the planning process, but in other processes in their communities? And on the other hand, we have very active communities that will threaten legal challenges to council's proposals. So there's an imbalance there that we need to address, and from our point of view, it's something that we work very closely with.
Would it be fair to say that wealthier communities have got more abilities than some of the poorer communities in dealing with that? And does that not mean that maybe some advocacy is required in that regard?
I don't think it's just to do with financial wealth. I think it's to do with knowledge as well.
That's why I said advocacy. I didn't say money. Yeah,
it's an issue that comes back to education in schools and teaching children to be active citizens. From my perspective as a mother and a planner, that you have a responsibility to ensure that people get involved in their environments. And I've seen some very good projects. There was an exhibition in Parliament from a high school in Pennycook that have been involved in a placemaking project, if you like, and had become very active as young people and came to speak to a number of planners and architects about it. And it was fantastic to see that. Now, why isn't that happening in every community? I think we all have to ask ourselves that.
Thank you. Mr MacLeod, you wanted to come back, and can I ask you to be very brief, because I have got a huge amount of names on my list now.
Only on the issue around communities and engaging with local plans, it is really it is difficult, particularly with the timelines involved. But I do think we're doing the right things. We're moving much more towards a design-led approach to development plans, so that people, instead of it just being a block shown of housing and people just, they don't appreciate what that means, it's about trying to show what it will actually look like if it is developed. And the other last point I think we could make a big difference is, at the moment we do neighbour notifications at the point of the proposed plan. And in many ways that's too late. We, for example, in Highlands sent out 15,000 letters in our recent consultation on the Innermurray Firth Local Development Plan. But it's at that last stage of the process. Quite apart from the fact that the legal, it's in legal speak, it's very regulatory, the notification. So I think as a group, as government and as the planning authorities, we can make a big difference by perhaps looking at doing that neighbour notification earlier and making people aware much earlier in the process.
How many responses did you get to your 15,000?
You've caught me. But I would say we got about 10% response. Okay. On that. Not all, perhaps directly from neighbour notification.
Maybe you can drop us a wee note and
I certainly
let us know the exact figure. Richard Baker, please.
Just one question, Convener. Mr MacLeod, at the beginning of the evidence session today, you praised the MPF as a punchy document. But last week we explored the lack of budgetary information in the document in relation to the national infrastructure projects which are listed there. And also we've received since then evidence from Aberdeen City and Shire Strategic Development Planning Authority, saying that while in the document failing to facilitate household growth is strongly warned against, how it can be achieved in a time of severely limited public spending isn't addressed. Wouldn't it be better if some of these very important and practical budgetary issues were actually identified properly within the document? Well,
I think the role of MPF, in my view, is to set it sets the picture of what's going to happen. I think there are perhaps other mechanisms for looking at how it's delivered. There'll be an action plan associated with it, and certainly there should be recognition within that of where the funding for the national developments, etc., will be coming from. But I think keeping the national planning framework as the spatial representation of where we want to go is the right way to go, the right way to present at the moment, and for the action programme associated with the NPF, or indeed other strategic documents that relate to those, for example, the transport schemes, to be where these budget decisions are made. I think the NPF already is a good representation of certainly national Scottish Government committed funding in that respect. And I'm not sure I'm picking the question up right. I don't know how much more detail would be useful.
I think what you're saying is it should be in the action plan, isn't it, rather than in the MPF document. And I can kind of appreciate that. Though I do note from your evidence as well that you're saying that the draft action programme set out in January could be improved, as it is, in terms of identifying where funding has been committed. So, I mean, it seems to me that there's generally a lack of information here throughout the process as a whole.
And I think that's right, because what's in there, if you take the green infrastructure, for example, absolutely fantastic, and I think ticks all the right boxes in terms of our looking at how we deliver a healthier population over the next 20 years, absolutely critical. But I think there are questions when it trickles down, as it inevitably does, to local development plans, and indeed to decisions on individual planning applications, about the burden that can be placed on individual councils or indeed developers to help deliver these, because it's all part of a big jigsaw, and unless we've got the bits at the local level set up, then these national routes will never happen. So that's the kind of detail I would like to see coming out of action programmes, that kind of joint working between local government and national government to identify how, and it's all about certainty, it's been mentioned quite a few times today, where a developer comes in, being able to give a developer confidence and certainty about what they'll be expected to provide. And that very much, I think we're getting much better at it, I have to say, but it is one of the areas that I think has been a proper criticism of the planning system in terms of perhaps the length of time taken to negotiate Section 75 agreements in delivering infrastructure. And part of that has been around a lack of clarity on what was going to be provided by whom and when. So the action programme, I think, provides a really good way of improving that, as well as efforts we're making as HOPs, as COSLA, and indeed as Scottish Government on things like processing agreements to speed up the process and give more certainty, on trying to make sure, working with our legal colleagues at all levels to make sure that Section 75 agreements are drawn up more quickly and that developers are given proportionate requirements. So there's a whole host of practical things we can do as planning authorities and Scottish Government, but I think there's also a role for the action programme to set the big picture.
Cameron Buchanan, please.
Thank you. I've got also another question for Mr MacLeod. I note you state in your 60-day statutory framework is both sufficient and proportionate, and yet the timings of the committee proceedings make it very difficult for local authorities to respond in time. Would you agree that denying councils time to respond is a fairly significant deficiency in the system? You did touch on that earlier.
I think there is a general... The general view that I was expressing there was that in terms of giving appropriate timescales for committee involvement at this stage, that this period was not long enough. And, you know, it is absolutely fantastic that the committee are spending so much time on this, not just this committee, but the other committees. And I think that's one of the areas that some authorities were commenting on. We've got this great opportunity to speak to you, but actually perhaps there hasn't been enough time in the run-in to properly prepare and get that democratic input.
Yes, I was going to say, because in fact the local authorities can't always respond within that 60-day period. Would you not extend that period a bit?
Well, I think that's where my comments were coming from, is that perhaps a longer period would have been more appropriate. Although certainly as HOPs we've managed to get a response to you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Following up from that, obviously the entire consultation period extends over quite a long time. Is that not the point where local authorities should have their say? Well,
and I think that's why I wrote, first of all, that it has been, the overall consultation period with the NPF has been absolutely right and proper and has given time for democratic input and the committee. I think it was really just this last phase that I was particularly referring to. But certainly the amount of effort that the Scottish Government went to go out, not just to your traditional halls and drafty community centres, actually going out and speaking to people in shopping centres and trying to get people to be creative about drawing what they would like to see, how they would like to see Scotland develop. I think it's been a real step forward, and it definitely has trickled down to how we deliver development plans.
Thank you. Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Convener. I think I'll maybe work the other way along the panel just to give Mr MacLeod a wee bit of a break. I note in the RIAS submission on page 3, it says, in representing the view of RIAS members, we find that there can be much negativity and unreasonable restraint in processing applications. I wonder if you could expand on that a little for us.
I'm just trying to find
It's the third to last paragraph.
third last.
Second to last paragraph.
I'm just trying to find if it was in relation to planning applications or appeals.
It's about delivery of the outcome from MPF and SPP, where it talks about culture, where the focus is not the process but the enthusiastic encouragement of an outcome which is beneficial to all concerned with a reasonable timescale. So it's talking about the planning process in general rather than specific element of the planning process.
Yes. I think that importantly, in looking at this, we're having to think of what's the bottom line. What are we expecting out of this? We don't give the primacy to the process. We're looking to what we actually end up with, and that in the road to getting there to get something that's beneficial, that there can be an awful lot of frustration and irritation and an awful lot of impediments in the way to get that to that beneficial outcome. I think that's perhaps what we're getting at here, and that in looking to the progression of an application, where you find that the days are measured by the applicant who's perhaps taken a borrowing, and there is which we call it a great cost associated with anything in delay. That it is important that there's a forward progression of the application through the system, which is not going to be inhibited by someone stepping in perhaps at a higher level than the officer who's dealing with it to set it back to the beginning again. It has to be a clear and transparent process, and with an expectation of a positive outcome. And it may be in association with that comment that I'd like to see local authority officials having a fuller participation in achieving a positive outcome, as opposed to being people who, perhaps by many practitioners, seem to be standing in the way or producing another policy or looking at some other difficulty which may arise when we're looking for a more positive and progressive process through to a positive result.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think we're still maybe talking a little bit around the houses on this. I'm not looking for naming of names or anything. I was simply looking for examples of the kinds of restraint or negativity that your members are coming across. I mean, you maybe don't have it to hand with you today, but it might be beneficial from the committee's perspective to receive maybe case studies which don't name names or identify locations, but give examples that would contextualise that sentence, because it was one that leapt out at me when I was reading your submission, that strikes me that if there are problems within the system, I think we need to know about them so that we can look at those further in future. So,
yeah, I thought it may be worth just saying, more generally, I think we do spend quite a significant amount of time debating the principle of development, the principle of location. I think one of the encouraging things that's emerging out of a national planning framework and supported through Scottish planning policy is this presumption in favour of development that contributes to sustainable development. I think there are some slight uncertainties there in terms of exactly what we mean by sustainable development. I know that the SPP is going to explain that in greater detail, and I welcome that. But I would like to get to a point where we spend less time debating the principle of development and focusing on the quality of development, on the placemaking of development, and on how we deliver it. The MSP mentioned earlier, where is the delivery? When are things going to happen? How are they going to happen? Once you start to pin down the location and the principle of development, you can focus on how you're going to deliver it, how the developers are going to afford it, and how we're going to work together to meet the aspirations and the expectations of communities on the ground.
Okay. Well, sticking with yourself, Mr. Tucker, I note your submission that it is peppered throughout with talk about proper resourcing, investing in planning. I don't have any money to give you, but what I would ask is this about, because obviously planning is a statutory function,
yes.
Is this about local authorities not providing adequate funding to the statutory function, or is it about the fee structure, and is that a way to improve the investment in planning that you're referring to?
I think it's a number of things, to be honest with you. I think NPF, it's very important that national planning framework and the national planning level needs to be able to influence decisions on resourcing of major projects and the delivery of major projects generally. Part of that's the planning system. Part of that's the resources that exist within planning departments. Part of it relates to skills. Part of it relates to seniority. I mean, there are some figures that have been provided on a reduction in the number of planning staff. What that does not pick up is the seniority of some of the people that have left the planning process over the last few years. There have been some very well-informed, skilled people that have moved out of planning departments. But partly it also relates to the work of the other agencies, making sure that other agencies across the country are all feeding into and supporting developments that are identified in the National Planning Framework SDPs, LDPs, etc. And I think that's also crucial.
Just on that, it was an interesting point you made there about the profile of the individuals who have left from within planning departments. How do you encourage knowledge sharing, knowledge retention? I mean, for example, we know of examples across local government, indeed across most organisations, where an individual will leave who was an expert in a particular area, and that knowledge was never shared or retained in other ways within the organisation, and it creates a gap. Is that something that you're concerned about within the planning setup?
Yeah, concerns maybe a little bit strong, but I think it's certainly worthy of note. I think partly that's about how departments share knowledge internally, so I'd rather not get into that. I think Malcolm's better placed to answer that. For me, the key is that planning authorities have vision about where they want to go and what they want to achieve. I think if you've got a direction of travel, if you've got a vision for what you want to achieve, then I think you can get people behind it and you can get a greater understanding of the direction of travel. I think where you're responding or reacting to things that are coming into the planning process, I think that's a bit more difficult. I think that's much more about expertise or experience of sites or situations, or even legal knowledge of how you would deal with an application. I think the plan-led system is going to help that, but crucially I think having a clear direction of travel set nationally and passed down through strategic and local development plans will also be part of that.
Okay.
That answer.
Perhaps you want to pick up on that, Mr. McLeod.
Yeah, there are a few points there that I obviously come at this slightly differently, in terms of I don't see that negativity and unreasonable restraint in processing applications. There are always examples that crop up where there are opposing views, but I think that we have done an awful lot in the last couple of years, certainly to improve how we do things. And that relates to, you are aware obviously of the approach that planning authorities have taken to preparing planning performance frameworks. So that it's not all about speed, and I think it is more about outcomes as opposed to process. And we've seen really good examples of how we're improving the quality side of planning in the last two submissions of our planning performance frameworks. So I think, yes, there are always issues, but it's all about continuous improvement, and I genuinely feel we're going in the right direction. We touch a lot on certainty and the fact that, perhaps some officers get involved in an application, which I think was your point, that reaches a loggerhead and then suddenly someone else steps in and moves everything back. But I think an awful lot of planning authorities now are getting much better at pre-application discussions, putting in place procedures for making sure they happen, and in an organised way that's about performance. It's about making sure you go back with as comprehensive a view as possible. And we're certainly doing a lot of work within HOPS on that. That's one thing that gives certainty. We've done a lot of work on processing agreements, on making sure the government's wish to see processing agreements put in place being enacted. But I think it relates to this issue of loss of skills and perhaps loss of staff. One area that we have committed to and are really keen to progress is around better benchmarking, because I think there has been a tendency to have it within authorities and not actually look to what's around you. So this year we've taken forward the benchmarking groups in line with what Solace groups, the chief executives, benchmarking families. So we've got all our families now set up. And instead of that being a chat, it's actually a very focused discussion around performance and trying to pick up best practice from across authorities. And I think that's one way we will start to fill these skills gaps, that we'll be able to see what works in Eastern Bartonshire or works in Orkney, and hopefully translate that as a partnership within HOPS and with the Scottish Government. And if I may make one last point, is around fees, and clearly our wish is for further fee increases. We saw a very welcome increase in fees last year, and there's evidence from across Scotland that has been invested in planning authorities, in getting graduate planners, in trying to focus in on the types of applications that are blocking the system. So when the renewable schemes, for example, some authorities have been investing in that side of things. So we obviously would like to see further fee increases. And I refer in my paper to a piece of work that was done by 15 authorities. And certainly the outcomes of that work, we hope, will inform Scottish Government in their approach.
I wondered if I could have one final question. Okay.
If I've got time at the end, Mr MacDonald. Anne McTaggart, please.
Now, really, it's to go back to something that was mentioned at the beginning. It was about the tie-in from the EU, and I'm sure it was yourself, Ms McIntosh, that had mentioned it. Can I ask the panel, do you think the omission from the EU perspective, is it about the culture, is it about the vision, focus, or is it about resourcing? Is it about all of that put together? Could I ask you to explain that more?
Ms McIntosh. Yes, certainly. In one of the initial NPFs, I can't remember if it was one or two, sorry, it was very much looking at Scotland in its European context in terms of a market that we do business with. So it was very much looking at its position in that market and how the national developments at that time weren't just inward looking, it was looking at how we were exporting and what our growth industries were. So thinking about that, for example, I represent a lot of people in the food and drinks industry, and thinking about what's coming up in terms of Scotland promoting food and drink worldwide. You know, there are tie-ins and opportunities for business in the national planning framework in a European context. That's what I'm saying, that I think there's a thread of continuity that runs through all of that that maybe has been slightly missed in terms of the spatial focus just purely on our boundaries.
So if that's missing just now, what are you putting into place for that to happen? If that's missing from the NPF 3 just now, what are you putting into place for that to link together?
Well, it wouldn't be for me to put into place. In terms of what the government should do, I think there's maybe an extra paragraph needed in looking at that, and I think it links to the sustainable economic growth focus that's in there. So I think having that thread running through the document and mentioning our European context is very important to those looking at us as well as those within our boundaries. Because the Scottish planning system, albeit that we all have niggles with it, is watched closely from a European context. We were happy and proud to host the European Council of Town Planners 2 years ago, and my colleague was a former president of that. And it's something that we're watched because we have a progressive planning system. Let's not beat ourselves up about that. We're good at planning. We have Patrick Geddes, is the founder of modern planning, who's here. We're proud to be planners. It's getting back to that and making sure that we really sing the praises of planning through these documents and not just focus on where there are problems.
Okay. Thank you.
Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Tucker, in your comments earlier on, you stated that planning is a democratic process. Now, to play devil's advocate for a moment, it could be suggested that there are occasions where the local planners and their recommendations to councillors are overturned if an application then goes to the reporter. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, it does happen, and that's the system. We have mechanisms within our planning system that allow, for example, departures to the plan. We have a system which allows members to overturn a recommendation for approval. Sometimes recommendations which even comply with the plan, which has also been approved by members. So as a system, it's capable of debate, influence, and it's got that flexibility. And actually, I think it's hugely important that it has that flexibility. I'm not suggesting that the system whereby it's in the plan and therefore that's just the way everything's going to happen is actually the right way for things to happen. When things do go to appeal, communities get an opportunity to be represented, to address the reporter, to be part of that discussion. Sometimes the decision to appeal is that the process was wrong, and actually that's why the appeal is upheld. Sometimes it's the reporter's view that for good planning reasons something should be allowed and a development should be given a consent. I don't think that necessarily cuts across the democratic process that is planning. What I mean is that the first point in all this process is a planning recommendation, and there are a group of locally elected members are the people who make a decision upon that.
So just in summary, the process that we have at the moment is flexible and adaptable, and you think it's correct?
I think it's flexible and adaptable. I think probably all of us would accept we could do with a bit more certainty. And I do think that sometimes if we get to a position where we're more open with communities up front, so for example the point earlier on about longer term planning, visionary planning, if communities know what's coming well in advance of buying that house or making that decision to locate there, I think that's healthy. Because I think although the upfront discussion sometimes is more difficult, I think it avoids the disappointment and frustration that can come further down the line when people see things happen that they simply didn't expect or maintain they weren't aware of.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And Ms McIntosh, in your comments earlier you spoke of the communities getting involved certainly at an earlier stage, and that kind of follows on as well from the comments from Mr Tucker there. And you also mentioned that you don't think that individuals and communities actually do that. Obviously, local community councils, they are a statutory consultee, but do you think there is a do you think that in recent years or in the past that local authorities or planning departments have maybe not so much treated the kind of local areas with disdain, but have maybe not fully considered that actually there may well be other opinions or other views or other suggestions from communities and from individuals that actually could be taken on board and to help improve a particular planning application?
McIntosh.
We have seen some community councils manipulate the process for their own good, and we've seen through the lack of electability, if you like, in the community council process, people occupy positions that have been there too long or have a particular agenda that they're pushing. So we have seen that throughout Scotland, and we all know of instances where that happens. But again, through promoting active citizenship, there is hope that that will change. I mean, certainly planning authorities do have a duty to go wider, I think. Whether the system at the moment allows them to do that, they're very much bound by statute, and the hierarchy of developments allows the developer to go wider in terms of specific types of developments. And I think that possibly links to where we're getting it right. For major developments, we're doing a lot more at national level. We're doing a lot more for major developments that are over a specific threshold. But there are an awful lot of communities where there are developments that come forward that are within the sort of local minor developments hierarchy, sort of box, if you like, that can have very significant impacts on communities. And we don't necessarily have a formal consultation process that takes that into account. So on one hand, we're doing well in the planning process at eliminating the small-scale applications and giving people increased permitted development rights. And we're giving very much sort of focus on engagement, if you like, early engagement on major developments. But everything that's left in the middle, which is probably the largest proportion of applications, which involves expansions to things like small to medium-sized enterprises that are keeping us going at the moment, let's face it, these people can often find barriers to the planning process, as Hugh's talked about, but at the same time, they can often have an impact on communities, positive, negative, or otherwise, that people ought to be getting involved in. And we don't really allow them to do that at the moment. We're not quite there in the middle zone of applications. So I think there are opportunities, and that's where, obviously, the mediation process and trying to identify the key players in local communities that often don't sit on community councils on a windy Monday night for 2 hours listening to street lighting and signposts. They're doing other things. We're not speaking to those people at the moment. We're not finding them. We're not getting them involved in planning.
Do you have any suggestions as to...
Well, very briefly,
Yeah, sure.
in very brief responses, because I am aware that Mr MacLeod has to be at another committee later on this morning.
Do you have any brief suggestions as to how we can actually try to empower these individuals to get them involved?
I'll keep it brief. Certainly the increase in community development trusts has been something that I've been impressed with, and people getting involved in doing things in their local community and linking to the planning process that way. Local planning forums, area partnerships, things like that, networking between different organisations that can increase the social capital in a particular zone of a city or community, whatever you like, that can feed into the planning process. We need to seize those and be getting in there at those different types of meetings and getting people involved.
Okay, thank you.
If you're very brief, Mr MacDonald, with your last point.
It was simply to ask Mr MacLeod, of all people, the point where you talk about the MPF being the where and the SVV being the how. Obviously, there's also the local development plans, strategic development plans that lie underneath that. We heard from the Minister at our last evidence session that there are too many authorities who don't have up-to-date local plans. What's being done to rectify that?
Mr MacLeod.
Well, there's a number of actions that we are taking, because I think I absolutely would agree with that in terms of the speed of preparing development plans is actually the key to getting people involved, because if things drag out over a long period, people just lose interest or it goes off their radar, and before you know it, you've missed them. So what are we doing? We're looking at things like gateway reviews, where we're having other authorities coming in and looking at what particular authorities are doing, could they improve it, looking at experience elsewhere. So that's one thing I think that should draw benefits. And the other way I think has been useful, and we do have to find another word for it, but the use of charrettes, design workshops, that being mainstreamed into the preparation of local development plans gets a much quicker outcome than going away from a public event and coming back 3 months later. So I think if we can find a way of making it affordable for local authorities, obviously there are big resource implications, and changing our traditional way of doing things, I honestly think we will get there with speedier development plans. But we are trying, it is very much one of the work streams of HOPES to try and address the issue of getting these plans done quicker.
We're going to let Mr MacDonald back on in charrettes because he had his bit last week in that. Finally, one of my favourite documents, and some of the folk around the table know that I'm an Anorak, is the 1952 Aberdeen local plan. And in the foreword, which was written by Tom Johnson, the former Secretary of State for Scotland, and I paraphrase here, but he has a real go at the red weevils of bureaucracy holding up the planning system. Have we dealt with the red weevils of bureaucracy? In very brief answers. Ms McIntosh?
Not everywhere.
Okay. Mr Crawford?
I think we're most of the way there, I think.
Okay, Mr Tucker?
Planning is not about saying no.
Mr MacLeod?
Yes.
Very different answers. I wish we had more time to delve down into those answers further. You may want to send us a wee note where those red weevils still exist, and we'll certainly have a look at that. Can I thank you very much for your evidence today, folks? I suspend this meeting and we move into private session. Thank you.